to introduce Dr. Jameson Brennan, or Jamie. Maybe you go by most of the time, right? I first met Jamie. We were trying to figure this out a while ago. We were both working on our PhDs, I believe, and at an SRM meeting, and we're both talking about data. And one of the things I thought was really interesting about Jamie's beginning into his grad school and going on is he took a real approach, I think, in data analytics and coding and how that applies to rangeland science as well as beef cattle production on rangelands. I know he spent stints all over the western U.S., New Mexico, Colorado, and then he did it in South Dakota, where he did his PhD work at South Dakota State, and is now, you guys call it, is it West River? Is that?
Yeah, West River.
Yeah, West River there in Rapid City is where he's based out of. He's been doing some really, really interesting work in beef cattle on rangeland systems and intensive data collection, technology, and data analytics. So with that, it's all you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sam, for the introduction. Thank you guys for having me today to come talk to you. It's a real honor to be here. First time in Bozeman. I've heard a lot about over the years. So as Sam said, my name is Jameson Brennan. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science at South Dakota State University and extension livestock raising specialist. Just a little bit of background, real quick, just to add on what Sam just said. So I was actually born in Missouri, grew up in Missouri, and then I worked for about 10 years. I did my undergraduate work at Colorado State University, and then spent about 10 to 12 years working in Western rangeland systems. So New Mexico, I spent about 5 years at the Horonata Experimental Range down there, worked in Nevada, Eastern Colorado, and a little bit of work kind of over here on the eastern side of the state as well. And so I did my PhD and I completed it in range science at SDSU in 2019. And so given that I had about 10, 12 years of background collecting research data, I really decided to focus. I had reading plot frames down. I had that down pat. So I figured I probably read about 15,000 plot frames over that time. And so I really decided to focus a lot of my specialization in data science. And so anticipating with a lot of this precision technology, remote sensing tools that are coming online, we really need people that have the skills to be able to handle these larger data sets and handle them efficiently so we could actually turn those in a meaningful time frame into meaningful metrics that we could use to better improve management for livestock production on the landscape. And so that's kind of where I ended up now in my current position. And as we kind of start moving towards precision livestock technology for beef production systems. And so when we talk about precision livestock technology, there's a lot of examples that exist out there on the landscape right now, and a lot that are coming online currently. These are things like activity collars that you put on animals that are able to detect different behaviors that these animals are doing. It's pretty amazing if you go into a modern dairy facility and what kind of technology they have available within those, things like robotic milkers, automatic feeders, or even precision feed mixing machines that are out there, smart ear tags, weight detection cameras, so cameras that can actually reconstruct that 3D image of animals and get an estimate of body weight, body condition score off of those, and even kind of drones that can kind of basically construct a 3D image of those animals that are out there in those dairy systems. And so there's a lot of tremendous advances that have happened, primarily those focused on dairy and within feedlot systems out there. And so there's a lot less stuff that's been done, I think, on extensive range systems for this topic. And I kind of view beef production on extensive rangeland systems as it's kind of the final frontier for precision agriculture. There, where it's very even slow to adopt, and a lot of that has to do with challenges and things like having power to devices, right? So if you don't have infrastructure for power, you need to have solar or battery power to be able to drive sensors. You have communication difficulties, so if you have no cell service, you need to be able to get that information signal out for that to be able to turn into some kind of management decision within some kind of time frame that actually makes sense for the producer that's using these things. And so that's kind of where we've headed in the past couple of years. What we're kind of focused on is this Cottonwood Precision Ranching Initiative that we began over the past 5 years out of our Cottonwood Research Facility. And some of the technologies we're looking at up there we'll get into. What you can see here is our SDSU Cottonwood Field Station. It's located in western South Dakota on pretty typical northern mixed grass prairie plant communities out there. It is one of the oldest continuously operated experimental stations in the nation. And so we have, I think it was established in 1907. We actually have weather data going back on a daily basis in 1907. We have a long-term grazing study that we've implemented out there since 1942 under 3 different stocking rates. And so we've overlaid a lot of these technologies on that long-term stocking rate study that we have out there. And really kind of our hope is we've got a lot of history and research associated with the station. Now let's take it towards the 21st century and how do we start incorporating some of these technologies into that production system. And so some of the things that we're looking at specifically on our research station include things like virtual fence technology, to manipulate livestock distribution on the landscape. We've also been utilizing smart scales. So these are scales that we put in pasture that are put in front of your existing water tank, and they essentially get a front end weight on your animals every time they go up to drink, and then read an RFID tag on them. We got precision feeders, so feeders that could measure intake of individual animals when they go to feed, as well as you can program these individual animals that we'll talk about a little bit later, where you could say you get 3 pounds of supplement, you get 5 pounds of supplements, tailoring these as opposed to the herd level to the individual level out there. Things like green feed, we're measuring enteric emissions of animals on pasture. We've kind of built a whole armada of these now. We've got 20 of these that are deployed throughout the state on our experimental station, within feedlot studies, on our campus facilities, as well as on beef and bison producers across South Dakota as a whole. And then things like remote sensing and gridded climate data sets. So this is kind of where I like to live a lot of times, is that there's just a tremendous amount of free and open source data that exists out there in the world. A lot of times this free and open source data, you might take a lot of programming skills to be able to extract that information and turn that into meaningful metrics for producers. But I think it's a huge resource, and I would say most of, in range science, we probably have much more advances in remote sensing side of things, but this is where I really enjoy some of this work, because one, it's out there and it's available, and two, it's free, and most other data collection is expensive, right? And so how do we better leverage these existing technologies, data sets that exist out there, and incorporate those into our decision models? And so overall, when we talk about precision livestock technology, the promise of precision livestock technology is that we're going to increase efficiency. So increase operation efficiency, maybe increase beef cattle efficiency. Then the landscape, we're going to reduce our environmental footprint associated with that. So maybe it's less inputs that are going into our production system, or through things like virtual fencing, maybe we're better able to manage our grazing or forage resources out there on the landscape, and overall improve sustainability. So whether these things are actually realized, I don't think we're there yet, but I think this is what is sold a lot of times when we talk about precision livestock technology. So here's what the promise is for these things. What does that actually look like on a practical scale? Now, a lot of this talk, I kind of decided to go in this direction of how do we actually, at least in my opinion, maximize the impact of these precision livestock technologies. And so we're looking at things like the economics associated with it. What's the practicality of deploying these technologies on pasture systems? But really, I see the integration of multiple different technologies together as really being kind of the future of precision livestock technology. It's not just this one widget or this one ear tag. It's this one ear tag that's maybe integrated with remote sensing data and then integrated with another sensor to be able to build a whole holistic picture of that animal production system that we're on out there. In addition to integrating these multiple different technologies together, how do we incorporate these data streams to feed into AI or machine learning models to be able to develop predictions? And then that last part there is how do we then take those things and feed them into animal nutrition models that exist out there? Again, to better build this whole production system as opposed to just studying one or a single piece of technology. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of this talk, is some of the work that we've been doing and integrating these different technologies together, and maybe how we've been kind of thinking about this as opposed to maybe more traditional, economics or does it work? And so this is a little bit of a confusing diagram, but I really like this one. So we had a graduate student named Anna Daigle that had put this, and she had adapted it from a paper by Dr. Tedeschi in 2019 of this conceptual framework of basically precision technology. And kind of when she was presenting this, I kind of laughed. She was mentored by myself and my colleague, Dr. Victor Menendez. I kind of thought it's funny that over here on this side, you have data management, data preparation, and machine learning. And so how do we take all of these thousands or millions or billions even data points and funnel those into pipelines, into machine learning models? And then my colleague on the other side of that equation lives over here on kind of system dynamics and mathematical nutrition modeling. So how do we feed all this information into there? We can incorporate these into systems thinking models, animal nutrition models, and this is unfortunately our poor grad student that's caught in the middle of these two worlds and trying to instruct them on this, which you done a very good job on. But I think this really conceptualized a lot of the direction that we've been going, pulling all these millions of data points, processing them efficiently, funneling them to statistical models that then get funneled into nutrition models as well. And so for that, I'll give you a little bit of an example of one of the studies that our grad student did, Anna Daigle. And so she had a study that was looking at precision supplementation effects on heifer development and reproduction on extensive rangeland systems. And so kind of the premise for this work is that low input range-based systems, developing heifers on range can potentially reduce costs as opposed to developing on things like corn residue stocks or developing within dry lot systems. There's some other potential benefits that have been shown where maybe you have improved grazing management or grazing behavior when it comes to the springtime, that these animals have been out grazing for that whole time period. And so what you're able to do under these systems is better maximize an existing resource, which is your dormant season forage. And so this dormant season forage tends to be of lower quality. According to NOAA, you can even get down to 2 or 3% crude protein on some of these forages that I learned this morning from him. So oftentimes, if you're going to supplement animals on these low input range-based systems, you often require supplementation, right? We need to be able to supplement these animals with protein or potentially energy to increase or reach your average daily gain or performance metrics that you're shooting. And so there's a lot of challenges associated with this if you're supplementing animals at the herd level. These include things like overconsumption or underconsumption, and supplementing at that herd versus that individual level. So just because I'm putting out 5 pounds of supplementation per head per day, if I'm feeding these animals in a bunk, it might be that you're slightly more dominant and you're going to knock your neighbor over and eat 3 pounds of their feed. And so you're going to get 7 pounds, you're going to get 3 pounds, you're going to get 1.5, you're going to get 6. And so overall, at a herd level, you're getting 5 pounds per head per day. But at the individual level, you're often off that target, right? We're not quite sure how because we're not measuring how far off the target. And so kind of the objectives of this study is, one, we wanted to be able to deploy some of these precision feeders and smart scales and be able to train heifers to use these things in pasture. It's really key for a lot of these different precision technologies is that you have some kind of training phase associated with them. You can't just put out a precision supplementation feeder and expect all of them to go to it and use it. There has to be a time frame, essentially, when they're locked into this dry lot period where they learn to adapt and learn to associate, like this is a candy machine that I need to go to be able to feed off of. We wanted to look at differences in performance and supplement intake for conventional versus supplemented heifers. And then we wanted to develop a precision systems model that integrates kind of real-time daily weight gain data to prescribe supplement delivery to target nutrient requirements for individual heifers, right? And so I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. How this feeding trial was set up is basically we had 50 heifers, or 60 heifers, 30 in each treatment group, so 30 went to the precision group, and 30 went to what we call a traditional bunk feeding system, and they were fed 5 pounds per head per day of dried distilled grain pellets. And our goal was to try and target the weight of these heifers, 60% of mature cow weight at time of breeding, so approximately 840 pounds, which is a pretty common management recommendation for our part of the country. And you can see here, here's a traditional bunk fed group sitting around waiting to get fed. And then this is our super smart feed producer unit. I don't know, they all call their units all about the exact same thing. I mix up what they are. But this is what our red wagon essentially is, we call it. And how this thing works is your animal goes up, it'll put its head in there, it'll read that RFID tag on, slowly drop your distiller grain pellets until they reach their allotment for the day, and then it'll cut them off for the rest of the day so they're not able to access. And so we supplemented heifers from November until May in this experiment, and then we deployed in those pastures as well these smart scale units that you can see there. So within each pasture, we had a smart scale unit to be able to track and collect that front end weight data for those animals. And then we did some calibrations across a bunch of different classes of animals to see how that partial body weight compared to full body weight. We had an R squared actually about 0.97 for those. We had a pretty good sense that there's a good correlation between those two. And so looking at heifer performance, you can see our average daily gain in our control there is about 1.93 pounds per day. And then our precision group, we had about 1.76 pounds per head per day. For our performance, you can see here, these are actually all the individual animal weights that we got over the course of that season. And really they start converging kind of somewhere around the first couple of days, maybe 2 months of that production system, where those trajectories of those two groups of animals start converging. And so if animals work, some of the bigger take homes associated with that is that we have a big difference in terms of control of intake. And so our control group, I think that's supposed to be pounds, but that's 870 pounds per head that we fed in terms of supplement to that control group versus that precision group was 683. And so that's a pretty big difference in the amount of supplement that we fed between these two different animals. And that's with both of them having essentially allotment of 5 pounds per head per day. And so some of the things we found from that precision feeder is that not all animals ate that full 5 pounds per day, nor did they eat every day. And so you have some animals that are what we call regular users that are going to go up, they're going to get their full allotment on a daily basis. Once they're cut off, they're cut off. We have some that are, we're going to, maybe they'll get 3 or 4 or 5 pounds a day, not quite their whole allotment before they go out and start grazing with the rest of them. And then there's a subset of them, about 5 or 10%, that they might skip 3 or 4 or 5 days in a row before they go to this feeder, right? And so they're a lot less interested in utilizing these technologies. And we're seeing that across a lot of our different technologies, is that there's always going to be a subset of animals that just are not interested in utilizing these things, putting their head in there. And that has some consequences downstream, I think, of what we think about in terms of selecting animals for precision technology. Maybe you're selecting animals that are more docile, more easily trained on those, and there's some consequences on range. But that's kind of some of the bigger findings we saw there. One of the big differences too within that precision supplementation is that it eliminated overconsumption. So you're not actually able to feed more than that 5 pounds per day. I think we had about less than 1% where they did actually exceed that just through a software glitch in that program. On average, precision group had a significantly lower average daily gain than our control group. And then we looked at pregnancy rates, and although we didn't have a significant difference in pregnancy rates, it's likely just due to sample size in this, wasn't focus for this, but the 83% pregnancy rate in that control group versus 67% in that precision group. And so although that's not a significant difference, it would be hard to sell that to a producer as a significant difference, right? That's a huge difference in terms of reproduction between these two systems. And that's likely due to one, these animals being out there within this feeder and maybe not getting that regular supplementation. Even if I'm getting not quite 5 pounds per day at the bunk, I'm probably still getting something every single day when we put that feed out there versus that feeder where maybe they're just selectively getting feed whenever they feel like it. Maybe their animal nutritional plane is on a lower basis. And so what we did after our trial ended is that we basically used the data that we derived from this first experiment comparing traditional versus bunk feed to develop a range supplementation model. And so the overall premise of this is, let's say we have a heifer and her current body weight is 694 pounds. If we look at her current average daily gain from the smart scales, we can basically project out that at time of breeding, she's going to weigh 793 pounds if she's on this current trajectory. And that's under 840 pounds of target weight, right? So we want them to weigh 60% of mature body weight at time of breeding. And so there's our target. And so we need to adjust how that animal is gaining over the remaining time period that we have there to be able to get them to that target weight. And so that's essentially what our desired average daily gain is, right? So maybe our current is 1.4 pounds per head per day, or 1.4 pounds per day, and we need them to be at 1.7 pounds per day. And so under this scenario, we probably want to increase that individual supplementation, right? Because we want them to gain faster what we have out there on the landscape. And that's basically what this model is that we put together with our student there. And so how this model works is eventually you have kind of our first inputs here, which go from our SMART scale. And so these are our login credentials associated with our CLOC. We have a start and stop date of when we want to query data. So let's say we want to go from the 1st of November until what our current date is today. And that's when we want to stop for that data. And then what's our trial and start and stop dates? We start on the 1st of November. We're going to carry this out until June 1st. And then what's our target body weight? And so what we do is from that ADG model, we wrote what's called an API, which is automatic programming interface. And essentially what that does is it's a piece of script or code that'll query that data direct from the cloud and pull that data into our statistical programming software and basically calculate these metrics in real time, so within a daily basis. And so we could estimate current body weight of those heifers at the individual level, what's our predicted weight, what's our current average daily gain, and then what's our desired average daily gain for the rest of that trial. And then from there, we feed this into an animal nutrition model. We can say, here's your current body weight, what's your forage TDN, what's your supplement TDN. And from that information, basically kicks out what's your anticipated full body weight of gain. So what's our predicted from the NASM equations, what's our predicted average daily gain at this level of supplementation. And then that final component there is basically of the supplement optimization model. And basically it'll run through and say, okay, if you need to increase supplementation, it's going to increase it at 0.01 increments per kilogram until your desired rate of gain matches your full body weight of gain. Is this confusing? Are we good? I can see a couple thumbs up. And basically all it is just iterating around in this cycle and trying to determine, okay, I want this heifer who weighs 694 pounds. I need to feed her 6.7 pounds per day to be able to get her average daily gain up where I want it to be. And so from this model, we basically, for this first step, is tested this on the heifers that we had from that data set. And so we applied this model on 2-week intervals to these heifers. And that's basically what this these model results are for these different heifers of what we should have been supplementing over the course of that time period versus what we actually did. And really it breaks down to kind of 3 different classes of supplementation patterns that we have here. And so in that first one, A, you can see that red is kind of that fixed what we fed. They're allotted 5 pounds per head per day or 3 kilograms per head per day. That blue is basically what we fit based off our nutrition model, what we did. And so in this case, we're probably over supplementing the A, where we're giving them, 2.3 kilograms per head per day. But maybe that animal only needed 1.5 kilograms per head per day to get to the 840. So we might be using excess supplement on those animals under that scenario that they don't need to be able to get that desired weight gain. Under B, kind of that opposite scenario where maybe we're feeding them at 2.3 pounds per day and they're not gaining fast enough, and we need to be ramping up that supplement on that individual. And then C, where you have a little bit of jitteriness there, but it's pretty close to that line where we're supplementing them pretty close to a level that they actually should be out there in the landscape. And so I ran through all those kind of 2-week scenarios of whether we're like supplementing with the right amount, over supplementing or under supplementing. We actually had about 69% of the time we predicted that we're over supplementing these animals and under supplementing on 31% of those feeding occurrences that we have there. And then, so that's where we wrapped up with Anna's work. And then we have a new student, her name's Hadley Dotts, that actually conducted this experiment last winter. And so we're working through that data right now. But we actually implemented this model on these heifers for this past winter. We were dynamically adapting individual heifer supplementation every 2 weeks based off of this model. And so some of the early conclusions from that looks like, yeah, we did have actually an impact on those heifers. For that control group, they were over by a pretty significant amount of that 840 target with a pretty wide dispersion. The final body weights versus that precision supplement group was much narrow variation within that group that we saw as a whole. And there's some other things in there that we're kind of looking towards the future of how do we better capture things like now bringing in weather or climate API data to be able to pull in that. So if we need to increase energy for these animals because you're going to have a negative 20 snap weather, how do we start incorporating maybe some of these nutrition dynamics? But overall, it went pretty good last year. Looking forward to student writing that up, presenting some of that work at SRM this year. Next, kind of to illustrate these two, virtual fencing and how we're thinking also about integrating some of these technologies together. Is anybody familiar with virtual fencing here? A couple of hands, maybe not everybody on there. So virtual fencing 101, basically how this works is that you have a collar that's on these animals, and this collar has GPS enabled on it. And essentially it works like you would think of a dog shock collar to be able to train dogs to virtual fencing. And so with this base station we have here, we're able to communicate via software to these collars and basically draw pasture boundaries anywhere we want out in the system, right? So I could draw a pasture boundary right here through the middle of this. And as this animal is slowly approaching that boundary, it's going to get a beep. If it continues, it's going to get an electrical cue on there to turn that animal around within that system. And over time, you can essentially train these animals to associate that beep with that shock sound and then better manage your animals on the landscape. And so we've been utilizing virtual fence now for about 4 years out of the Cottonwood Station, looking at things like what's the impact of like virtual rotation versus continuous graze, and how does that impact animal behavior, animal performance, what are the economic costs associated with virtual fencing versus traditional fencing. And so for student Logan, kind of pioneered some of that work for us. Some of the things we found is really over the past 4 years, we found very little influence of virtual fence on animal behavior. It doesn't seem like it's really significantly increasing grazing, resting, walking time associated with animals on the landscape, as well as no real differences in animal performance. So that's kind of one of the benefits, I think, of this technology. I think anytime you roll out something new, whether it's a new grazing management strategy or a new necklace on an animal that's administering zaps to them, you can anticipate a world where that might negatively impact performance. And as a producer, I would be concerned about what is the impact of all these things fundamentally on performance of animals, because ultimately that's where I make my money. So we haven't found that really it impacts animal performance all that well. And the other thing is that we found is that technology actually, if it's working properly, can be pretty effective at controlling animals on the landscape. Now I couldn't get a bigger asterisk than that on my PowerPoint, but this is a huge asterisk right here of if the technology is working properly. Except that's not always the case. That's not the case for a lot of precision technologies, that they're always working properly. And so over the years, we've had a number of issues in terms of things like collar retention on these animals. We're up to like 50% of collars have fallen off of them. Battery issues, stuff like that. We kind of ran through the gamut of issues that we've run into with them. But that being said, if they're working properly, you can actually effectively control animal movement in the landscape. And so there's promise there, but there is quite a ways to go before it's maybe integrated more fully on ranch systems, or maybe more turnkey, I guess, within those. And so for part of Logan's work that he did, he looked at 2 different technologies. One is these smart scales. We deployed the smart scales out on pasture. And then we had those virtual fence collars that we essentially treated for his study as GPS collection devices. And so these things were set at 5-minute intervals. And we actually got pretty good regular data off those virtual fence collars for the first 2 years of this project. And so one of the questions Logan was interested in, my student was looking at, what is this energetic cost associated with grazing, right? So if we have animals in feedlot, we know that basically you're brought your lunch every day and you got to go to the pump and eat your feed. we have an animal that's out there on the landscape, right? We have a heterogeneous landscape. We have different topographies that are out there. We have a diversity of forages. We have water sources. So this animal has to go out, graze on the landscape, climb hills, climb down hills, find its forage, and then maybe it's got to go back to water after it's done all that for a couple hours. And the point being is that the energetic cost associated with this is not zero, right? It takes some energy to go out there and graze and get your lunch out there on the landscape. And so some of the work Logan did is that it basically took this equation that was developed by Dr. Dept that's looking at net energy for maintenance activity. And so we've got net energy for maintenance requirements. And then on the top there, what's that net energy for maintenance activity? How much energy are these animals expending to go out there on the landscape and graze and collect that forage out there? And how can we potentially estimate that using some of these different precision technologies that we have available to us? And so you can see from that equation, kind of the big components there is you have these coefficients that they derived empirically from studies, and you have resting time as a big component. You have kilometer flat travel, so that's travel across flat lands like you would see on this floor here if I was walking across it. And then we have kilometers ascending travel. So if I'm walking up that mountain that I see over there, that's going to be an increased energetic cost to be able to climb that mountain and be able to walk on flat landscapes. And then that last part is that full body weight for those animals that we have there. And so from this, we basically derive these metrics for each individual animal based off of one, the GPS collar. So from that GPS collar, it's fairly easy to actually parse that data out into resting and moving behaviors associated with that. So we could take from that GPS collar, we could estimate hours per day of resting for that individual animal. And then we could parse that out to either flat or ascending travel based off of overlaying this on a digital elevation map. So for each sequential GPS point, we could see did it increase or decrease in 1 meter of elevation. And from there, you can pull it into ascending or flat travel. And then that last part from the SMART scales is that we're able to estimate daily full body weight on these individual animals on the landscape. And so basically, how do we pull all these information and technology together, feed them into this animal nutrition equation, to try and build a better picture of that energy for activity associated with grazing on the landscape? And that's basically what this is here, is your net energy for maintenance activity cost per day. These are individual heifers across 2021 and 2022, or steers, I apologize. What we found is there's really no difference in terms of stocking rate, rotation versus continuous grazing strategies within those systems. But kind of the point here is, can we take all these data points, technologies that are delivering these, and actually turn these into an estimate that might actually be meaningful in terms of energy expenditure on pasture for these animals? And then lastly, another one we're talking about that I've been working on for a little bit is how do we develop a precision grazing management model on these? And kind of thinking along the same lines of, we've got collars up there, we've got smart scales, we've got remote sensing data. How do we start incorporating these pieces of information together to be able to tell the picture? And so for stocking rates, stocking rates are hugely important for the field of range management. It's basically an estimate of number of animals per unit of time, per unit of land out there. And they're really important to be able to make sure we're meeting our forage utilization targets. So if we want to take half, leave half, or if we want to over or under graze for whatever management reason, we need to have an appropriate stocking rate set to see if we're actually hitting our management targets. Potentially minimize overgrazing associated with these, and like I said, meet those management objectives. Now the problem with stocking rates, right, is that we tend to set them and then not revisit them for years. And so even though our cow has gone from 1,000 to 1,400 pounds, right, doesn't matter. It's all a wash at the end. But really the problem for stocking rates is they require knowledge of kind of three things, right? They require knowledge of forage production, they require knowledge of animal body weight, and they require knowledge of dry matter intake to be able to accurately calculate stocking rates properly. And all of these things are dynamic through time, right? So if we have stocker steers that are out there, your steers are gaining weight throughout that time period. And maybe you can estimate what a mid-season weight is and use that for your stocking rate calculator. But again, your weights are dynamic through time. Your forage production is often dynamic through time, right? As you go through the growing season, you have rapid growth in the spring, then you start senescing and dropping off after there. And that quality is also changing as you move through time. And then dry matter intake, we tend to apply maybe 2.5% of body weight to that, call that dry matter intake good. But that can also potentially be dynamic through time, whether that's heat associated or other factors that might be driving changes within the day. And so kind of the objective of this, and kind of going back to that figure of how do we better drive impact from some of these precision technologies, is really let's develop a machine learning model so we can make forage quality and quantity predictions on the landscape. Right, so that's going to be our forage prediction model over there. How do we incorporate smart scales to estimate daily animal performance within this system? How do we then feed metrics that we're deriving off of those into a dry matter intake model? So this is a model that essentially is derived from Jameson equations to estimate forage dry matter intake. And then can we apply this to determine, when we should rotate animals essentially on the landscape based on these factors? And so for this forage prediction model, basically wrote APIs, kind of similar to that smart scale, where we're pulling in data now from Google Earth Engine. So we're looking at things like Sentinel imagery that we're pulling off of these, as well as Prism climate data sets, and then creating metrics, things like growing degree days, cumulative precipitation, how far does that deviate from normal, kind of stuff like that we're then feeding into Bayesian random forest model to be able to predict forage quantity and forage quality over time. I've actually improved these predictions a bit since I made this figure, but generally speaking, we do a pretty good job of estimating biomass as well as estimating ADF systems. And so from these, we can then extract and estimate daily forage biomass predictions and daily ADF predictions. Now, the other part of this is that smart scale model. And so from these smart scales that are deployed in pasture, we're basically able to get daily weights on these animals, clean up kind of bad or erroneous data points that are within those systems. And then from this, we fit spline models for each individual animal. And from that spline model, we could then estimate daily weight and average daily gain off of those models for those animals that are out there in the pasture. One of the reasons we went with spline models is partially because it's able to capture nonlinear trends that we have out there as well. And so we tend to assume, right, if you measure your ADG in the traditional sense, you get a weight at the beginning of your range trial and a weight at your end of your range trial, and then you've got a straight line that just connects those two for average daily gains. This maybe takes a little bit more of that nuance in there using that daily data that we have available. And then we feed these into our dry matter intake model. And so this takes the inputs of ADF, which is coming off of our forage prediction model on a daily basis. We have body weight at time t, body weight at time t plus 1, so that essentially be today and yesterday for those, and then days on feed within that system would be 1, as we're calculating this. Feed those through Jameson equations. I'm not a ruminant nutritionist. I can get these to you if you really need to see it. That was verified by ruminant nutritionists these are equations that we're using that we're essentially back calculating dry matter intake for an individual level on an individual day based off these metrics that were in our model there. And so what this looks like on a practical standpoint, you can see at the top there, it's basically our estimate off of our remote sensing model of what's our daily ADF over the course of the grazing season. You can see there what's our kind of spline estimated weight for these steers that are out there on pasture throughout the whole season. And then that bottom one essentially is what is that daily dry matter intake estimated for this individual animal system. And so we can start building some of these things. And so this is for one pasture. What's our estimated DMI for each individual animal? Cumulative DMI as we move throughout that season there, right? And so generally speaking, when we would do this, I was kind of surprised, but yeah, almost every time they're between 2 and 3% estimated based off these metrics that we're feeding in there. So I think, DMI on rangelands is kind of this holy grail, I guess, I would say, of being able to calculate it, but I think we're well within the realm of reality when we're kind of putting some of these models together. And so from this cumulative forage consumption, we could then go to this next part, is essentially a grazing utilization. So how do we take inputs, things like number of hectares and percent forage allocation, and try and determine when should we rotate animals based on all these model parameters that we put together. And so what does this look like? Well, here, if I took all those individual steers that are in that pasture, or that cumulative dry matter intake, and I basically add them all together, that's for a whole herd and how much this herd is intaking, is what that red line is there. If you look at that green line, that's essentially forage that's been allocated. So of our total production, let's say we're going to allow 25% harvest efficiency associated with that for animals. And basically, when those two lines cross, then we've consumed as much forage as we allocated to them on the landscape, and that's when we should be rotating animals out there. And so this is kind of what I'd say is maybe our business as usual method, where we could say, all right, here's our pasture. We want to break this into 3 rotations. We're just going to use our long-term average forage estimate of 1,700 pounds per acre that's out there, or maybe I pulled that from the Web Soil Survey to get an estimate of my forage production. And then what's our mid-season weights for our animals? I'm not really accounting for these dynamics, but we're just going to say we're going to do about 25 days per rotation when we calculated it. It's kind of our business as usual. Versus a dry year, which is the 2021, and you can see there in rotation 1, we get about 23 days worth of grazing, so pretty close. Rotation 2, we'd have about 15 days, and rotation 3, about 12 days estimated from our model. And so what's happening here is, one, as you're going through, your animals are increasing in weight, so we're incorporating some of those dynamics into this. Our forage is senesced and dried out, and maybe you're starting to lose biomass that's out there on the landscape. And so we're incorporating some of those dynamics out there, and really trying to better capture these dynamics that are happening throughout the grazing season on the landscape. Conversely, if we looked at a wet year like 2023, we had a lot of production, and I think it looked like we barely even got on top of the grass out there. Our first rotation under this was about 63 days. We had about 3,000 pounds per acre, which is phenomenal for Western South Dakota. And so again, this is largely a modeling exercise at this point, I think, until we test it experimentally, but it is showing that we are capturing some of these dynamics that are out there in the landscape. And maybe we need to be better paying attention to these, especially when we start incorporating some of these precision technologies. And so whether it's the heifer supplementation or whether that's through stocking rates, there's a lot of work. How can we integrate some of these virtual fencing? But how do we improve grassland management and more closely hit our target with these precision technologies, right? So if I'm under a normal stocking rate, let's say I've set it for the past 40 years, and you're going to have a wet year where maybe you're understocked, and you're going to have a dry year where you're overstocked, and all these other years, because we never have a normal year. It doesn't exist. And so if you average all of those over that whole time, you're probably going to hit that center point, right? You average all of those points. But within any given year, you're missing that target. That's out there. Same with the heifers. Within any given heifer, you're probably missing that supplementation individual. So how do we move that target using precision technologies to better hit that, or at least get closer to it as we start incorporating some of these dynamics? And so a lot of this, there's still a lot of work, evaluate how close we actually are to these targets. I'm not a modeler. That's kind of Hector's world sometimes, where you can take that and run with it. But I like to be, I'm more of an experimental guy and see how close we actually are to the mark on some of these. As well as I want to evaluate some of our future work as potential for compounding error systems. So we have these different modules from different technologies that are getting plugged in. There is a potential that you're going to add error from here, add error from here, add error from here, and how is that getting compounded as we're moving throughout these whole models out there? It's kind of some of our future work. Now, I think we got about 15 minutes, right? Maybe 5, I don't know. Depending on how many questions I ask. But as you'd imagine, there's a lot of practical considerations. You think there's a lot of practical considerations for precision technology? Has anybody here used a lot of precision technology? All right, we're gonna have a support group meeting later, maybe. Actually not, it's all sunshine and roses, right? It all works 100% of the time, nonstop, fail safe, right? That's not the case. There's just a tremendous amount of limitations to implementing these things on extensive production systems. And I like to think we've learned them all, but I think every year we learn some kind of new limitation or a new thing that we didn't think of that failed, that we really should have anticipated, or maybe the manufacturer should have anticipated some potential point of failure throughout there. One, animals need to use the devices and use them correctly. Animals don't always have the most respect for research that we do out here. And so if you're a smart scale, if you have a wire, and maybe this wire was slightly exposed, and they didn't touch it for the first 74 days of your trial, and then one day steer or heifer decided, oh, I could reach up and grab that wire and rip all that. All of your data, all your machine is all basically not functional. This is one of my favorites from the early days. So this is an earlier version of the Vent's virtual fence collar that had these nylon straps, and then these are essentially what administer the electrical cue within that. If this thing gets flipped around, it could be sending zaps till the cows come home, but literally they're not going to come home. They're not out there on the landscape. In addition, the sound, the speaker is now nestled up against their neck, so they're probably not hearing the beep associated with that either. Collar failure was a big one. Like I said, I think the first year with these, we had about 75% retention. The second year, I think it was about 46% collar retention, so about 54% of them fell off over a 3-month grazing period, which is not an insignificant amount that is out there. It makes the system much less effective. Third year, we altered them, and that works about 95% effective on keeping these collars on. So it is possible to keep them on better, but again, trials that we're learning as we're going through. For all this equipment, climate is a big factor. We're in the northern Great Plains. We're routinely in the summer, we'll have days where we'll hit 105 degrees. Wintertime, we'll usually get down to -30, -40 degrees out there. That's a huge range of environmental conditions that you're putting this equipment in, that it's got to be able to work under those scenarios, right? And so it's very hard on equipment, it's hard on batteries, hard on power, to be able to operate under those different environmental systems that you have there. Communication protocols, it's always a challenge on Western rangelands. That's one of the biggest hampers for a lot of these technologies. Is that it's one thing to be able to collect that data. If you're actually going to use that data to inform management, you need to be able to get that information out and be able to turn it into a management recommendation within a time frame that's meaningful, right? If I found out that if I have a forage prediction model, and let's say, okay, here I am in December, and I had 2,300 pounds of forage produced this past year. Can I do anything with that information? Maybe a little bit, but it doesn't really help me at the time. I've already grazed and managed my system. Now you're telling me after the fact, here's what my forage prediction is. And so timely delivery of information really requires good communication protocols. And that's a challenge when you don't have cell service, you don't have power on these extensive range systems. And so communication is always a challenge. Battery life is a big one. Some of these virtual fence collars, we found, especially if you're in much more intensive rotations where they're interacting with those boundaries more frequently, your GPS is on a lot more, you're giving more stimuli, you potentially could drain a battery in a couple of weeks, as opposed to maybe multiple months if you're more extensive production. So battery life is always going to be a challenge. Data access platforms, a lot of this, let's say if you want to utilize different data from different technologies in a dream world, it would all be standardized in the same format. We'd acquire it all the same. That's not the case. If you've got 5 different technology platforms, you have 5 different potentially data delivery systems to get your information. And that's always going to be a challenge. And then labor. We can't discount this. And like we said in the beginning, the promise of precision technology is that we're going to save labor, make it more efficient. These things take a tremendous amount of time and effort. That labor cost is not zero, right? These aren't turnkey, where I just put these collars out and I don't have to learn the system. They're just going to manage their animals there. There's a lot of effort that goes into being able to learn the system, the animal behavior, put these devices together. For our green feed units, we've got 2 technicians that are employed full-time just to keep green feed units running across the state, and that's with the expensive data package plan, maintenance plan with the company. And so the labor is not zero on these things. It's really important to consider if you start getting into this, what is that cost associated with that? And then programming skills is a big one. and et cetera, et cetera. We're still learning every day. We're still learning tricks and tips for these technologies. But programming skills are really kind of maybe how Sam and I got together to begin with. And so this is a quote that I don't know if I ever said it, but oftentimes it's attributed to me. But we have unprecedented amounts of data that we're collecting on rangeland systems. We're generating maybe 1 billion data points a summer now. And that has a huge learning curve to be able to efficiently process this data and information, right? You can't just open this up in Excel and expect to start making headway with a lot of these larger data sets. And so if you're going from maybe 600 animal weights, total data points that you were doing at the beginning and the end, so now we've got 47,000 animal weights on an individual level that all need to be cleaned and processed and handled efficiently. It's a lot of a learning curve that happens there. And so it's something that I've really been promoting. Is the value of open source code, and not just open source code, but the value of sharing that code between researchers and research entities. And so we've got a couple papers out there. So if you're utilizing like CLOC equipment, for example, we published that API code. So you can go in there and automatically pull that information off of the website and calculate your metrics. We use it most frequently to be able to just determine if the equipment's working properly. So we essentially get daily reports for all of our systems. And let's say I have a green feed unit and I was getting 50 good data points per day. Then all of a sudden that drops to 0. And then it drops to 0 the next day. Now I know I've got some kind of problem. I don't know what it is. Maybe it doesn't have any feed in it. Maybe the system's shut down and failed. Maybe they don't have access to it. The ranch manager moved pastures and didn't tell me, and now my system's out there without animals. But again, developing these protocols to be able to pull that information, turn it into meaningful management insights, and then troubleshoot when things happen, so you don't find out a month or two into your trial that your equipment wasn't working at the time, which is a pretty terrible feeling. I don't know if anybody can commiserate. But yeah, other things, developing open source platforms, and then how much time and effort that saves. And so within our cow-calf unit on our campus, we have an incentive system that basically measures dry matter intake and water intake for animals in the feedlot. Just wrote a quick code for a grad student, and they said that probably saved them about 3 months worth of data cleaning. And they ran that on all the past 3 years of incentive data that they had there. And they estimated it probably would have taken graduate student labor over a year to be able to go through and process and handle that. And so these are the kinds of things where if you could develop these codes, if you could share them with people that are also working in this field. I'm a big proponent of this, and if you ever say, hey, I'm thinking of using these technologies, reach out to me. I'll share some public code with you. I'm happy to do that. If it saves people labor, because then you can ask more interesting questions if you're not just spending all of your time data writing. Other things, understanding the biological system is important. These technologies are never going to replace good fundamental knowledge of range management and animal science. It's just not going to replace those. And so even though something might look good in an algorithm, and let's take our heifer supplementation model, if my model doesn't know that I can't go from 2 pounds per day to 10 pounds per day without potentially having some kind of consequence on animal health, right? And so we need to, as animal scientists, be able to think about what are some of these limitations that even though an algorithm spits out a number, should we go with that number? Maybe we should step up the supplementation every 10% for 3 days until we reach that high level, right? And so it's really important, and especially too when you start working with some of these companies that maybe they have a really good, talented engineering staff that maybe don't fully understand the production system that they're trying to apply that engineering stuff to. And so they need to know that, hey, you might tip an animal over if you increase the supplementation that fast on there. And so it's really important to understand your biological system. And then a virtual fence, there's a whole bunch of considerations, things like GPS error. You might think I'm outside the boundary, I'm in the management zone where I'm supposed to be, and maybe I'm just getting a 10 or 15 meter signal. Or I can't virtually fence out access to water, right? It's a common sense thing, but it has happened where somebody's put in a virtual fence boundary because I can just draw it on the screen anywhere and then say, hey, how are they going to get to this water that's outside of there? That's not going to be effective at training those animals. Or maybe my manager doesn't know where this virtual fence boundary is, and she drops a bale of hay over here, and so they all run and just break right through to go get hay, and now your system's infected. So it really takes kind of a different level of thinking or retraining your brain how you're going to implement this. Getting a little long on time, but I will say, extensions, rolling precision ranching, there's just a huge amount of companies that are getting into the space, technologies that are coming out, claims that I am less comfortable with than maybe others are within these spaces, and buzzwords like health metrics, real time, data-driven analytics, right? AI powered. AI powered could just mean a linear model that's running behind the scenes. We don't know, it's a black box. But there's a huge amount of companies that are getting involved in the space. And I think technology a lot of times is outpacing maybe the research that's being able to evaluate it. And I worry that more than a few of these might be kind of snake oil that's being sold out there to producers. And so it could be a challenge, one, to keep up with current technology, but actually evaluate what are our stakeholders' interests. And so really I see our role, not just from research, but from an extension standpoint, is one, disseminate research and education to stakeholders, but really be that mouthpiece to be able to provide unbiased information associated with these technologies. And so we've had a number of different virtual fence field days, and just really talk to them about realistic picture. If you're going to implement virtual fence, what's the labor cost? What's the time to learn the system? How effective is it actually on the landscape? What's calorie retention? One of the things we kind of did at our most recent one is we actually collared animals for producers to show them that process. That one, you need good cattle handling facilities to be able to put a collar on an animal without hurting yourself. And two, so it's kind of a counterpoint to if you see a video of maybe a nice 4-H cow that's getting a collar placed on it and it just nonchalantly saunters out of the chute, versus maybe some of our more rangy cows that are really fighting and bucking and get a picture of what does that actually look like. And so trying to paint that realistic, unbiased information picture for producers that might be considered. Now with that, I'd like to thank, I'm one person talking out here with a representative of a much larger team, many sponsors that are out there. So I'd like to thank all the funders and acknowledgements there, and if you have any time, happy to answer.
For your heifer study, did you notice any differences in between the two groups?
Any differences in
Calf birth weights between the two groups?
calf preg weights?
Birth weights.
Birth weights.
Birth weights.
Sorry.
Birth weights. I'd have to go find that data on there. No, I don't think so.
I have a question about that study too. How do you think that the pregnancy rates would have been affected if you used mature cows in that feeding strategy versus heifers?
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it might have been better. I would anticipate there. I don't know why, but we had a really low as a whole for animals. I think it was maybe some AI challenges that we had out there. We were just coming out of a drought that year too, so we might have had poor quality forage normal. They were grazing out there.
Yeah, one more question. I guess I'll continue on that study. This is more on the feeders of that study, not like the zones. Did you guys measure, record how many feeders you used, or how they were covered, land coverage? You guys look into that at all? Or was it just one feeder?
So we just had one feeder that was out there, and that one feeder had 4 feeding stations within that. This past year, we did use GPS collars on them just to see how that might affect the behaviors, whether those ones that were at the feeder were they just parked there waiting for this thing to dispense, feed again, or were they actually going out and grazing, and how it might influence some of those behaviors there. And then we moved it around one feeder, multiple locations of the pastures to increase distribution. And then we measured the range impacts,